Hey everyone, I hope you guys are all doing well and staying safe and healthy. We are your peer teachers for this week covering Chapter 10. My name is Allie Walentine and I will be covering Section 10.1 of this chapter. Daniel and Stuart will be going over the other sections with you in separate videos. So here we go, let's get started. Section 10.1 will help us describe the purpose of classroom management, or not classroom management, classroom assessment. So when you guys hear the word assessment, or when you hear you have to take a test, what is your first thought or reaction? Do you feel nervous? Do you feel frustrated? Do you get anxious? And why do you think you feel that way? Why do you think some people feel that way anyway? Um, and what's usually the main reason you take a test? Is it usually to show how much you know, or at least how much you can memorize, and then the purpose of it is so you get a good grade? Is that the only reason to take a test, or is that the only reason teachers give tests? Let's find out. Let's see. So, thinking ahead, these questions come straight out of our textbook, and if you would, maybe take a minute just to pause the video and write these down or type these up and try to think through these questions and decipher what your thoughts are. Hopefully, as we go through all three of these sections, you can gain some insight and learn the answers to these questions. So, number one, what do you think are the most accurate ways of measuring what a student knows and is able to do? How do you know when a student has truly learned something deeply? What are your preferred assessment strategies and how would you use those? What do you believe are the primary purposes of assessment? And finally, how can the use of assessment data be improved so that it is more useful in supporting high levels of achievement by all students? So, why do we assess students? What is our goal, or what should be our goal with assessment? In our textbook, it says, student assessment provides critical feedback to students and teachers alike about what students are learning as well as how teachers are teaching. So from here we learn two things. By assessing, we provide feedback to students, and we also gain feedback for ourselves and how we're doing as teachers. But then, how do we use this feedback? Or are we even using this feedback correctly? Huba and Freed define assessment as the process of gathering and discussing information from multiple and diverse sources in order to develop a deep understanding of what students know, understand, and can do with their knowledge as a result of the educational experience. So that was pretty wordy, but let's figure out and dissect kind of what we learned from this. Number one, we should be gathering information in multiple different ways using diverse sources. And number two, our results can vary, right? We can see what students know, or we can see what they understand, or we can see what they actually can do. But again, where do we go from here? The second part of this definition is the process culminates when assessment results are used to improve subsequent learning. So what did this part teach us? That our data and then the information we gather only does us any good when we use it to improve subsequent learning. So this means that we're using our findings to help increase student knowledge, student understanding, or student ability. But it can also mean that we're taking our findings and we improve subsequent learning by making ourselves better teachers, more fully equipped to teach our students and their diverse needs. So to reiterate, this is what we need for quality assessment. We need gathered information, and we need multiple and diverse sources. And if we do it right, this is what we should obtain. We should obtain a deep understanding of what students know, understand, and can do with their knowledge, but we should also obtain data that will help in subsequent learning. So, how do we make sure we use quality forms of assessment that will get us to this deeper understanding and a pathway to subsequent learning? We've learned that we should gather info and assess, but what do we do after that? In our textbooks, it tells us that quality assessment includes components. It's not just one stagnant thing that looks the same every time. So these components are identification of a clear purpose for the assessment, provide clear ideas or targets of what the student needs to learn or achieve. Quality assessments call for sound design, effective communication to students and other audiences. So basically, how do you communicate the results? And then finally, student involvement. So let's break these components down just a little bit further so we understand how to provide quality assessment. Number one, identification of a clear purpose. So is the primary purpose of your assessment to provide feedback to students, or is it to provide feedback to administration and their decision making? Or is it to see what your students know? Or maybe it's to see how well you're teaching them. Is the assessment for you as a teacher for self-reflection purposes? The purpose will be different for each assessment you provide. Not every method of the assessment yields the same results, so you're going to have a different purpose each time. That should be what you strive for. And number two, the second component is provide clear ideas or targets of what the students need to learn or achieve. So basically, what are your expectations for the students? Maybe these come in the form of objectives in your lesson plan, but the idea here is your students need to be aware of what these expectations are so that they know. And there are 5 types of targets the expectations can fall under. There's knowledge, reasoning, skill, product, and disposition. So the first one, knowledge, that's when that's when they show a mastery of subject matter. Reasoning is when students can use information to solve problems through processes like compare and contrast, or analyze the data, or classifying things, different things like that. Skill is when students should be able to exhibit behaviors and skills that demonstrate procedural knowledge appropriately. So an example of this, my major, for example, is ag education, and if I'm teaching a welding class, I need to cover safety, and before they actually go out to the shop and weld, I need to assess that they have learned safety. So the skill would be the target area because I want to have my students be able to exhibit safe behaviors and procedures, if that makes any sense. And then we have product. That's when students can create quality products that present evidence that they have mastered foundational knowledge or problem solving or different things like that. So that's when your students can put together a portfolio or something like that. And then we have disposition, and that's basically just when students can demonstrate appropriate attitudes or interests and motivational intentions. And then finally, the number 3, we have quality assessments call for sound design. So there are a variety of assessment methods. The important thing here is that your method of assessment should match the intended target like we just talked about. You need to design your assessments so they actually help you measure what you're trying to measure. And then you should write all types of questions down beforehand and make sure that you have been attentive to any potential biases that you may have, right? We can't let anything get in the way of us making quality assessments, especially bias or different things like that. Number 4 is effective communication to students and other audiences. So what is the best way to give results or feedback for the specific assessment you're giving? Are you giving it to students in the form of a test score, or are you giving it to administration? Who's your intended audience, and what's the best way to deliver the information to them? Are there good, better, or best options for each learning target? That's something that you have to experiment with as a teacher, because I think this could depend a lot on your students, your school, district policies, different things like that. And then finally, we have student involvement. That's our last component. And this comes into play when you make expectations and targets clear to students. You have to involve them in that very first step. But it also carries us forward into the later parts of assessment. So we can help them track their own progress and their goals. How are they doing in their assessments? So student involvement is huge and a very critical component to assessment. And that's going to help us provide quality assessment if we use and incorporate all 5 of these components. So here's an example of an effective way that someone has provided an assessment and effectively used their data to help students. So this is SRBI, it's Scientific Research-Based Instruction, and RTI, which is Response to Intervention. We kind of learned a little bit about this already, but this is a good example of using data in a helpful way that allows us to cater to our students' needs. So what they've done is, through gathering information, remember, in multiple and diverse ways, that's the 2 important components. Those are 2 important things we need. They've helped create better learning environments for students with learning or behavioral needs. So this chart is a nice visual of how they've done that, but the point is, after providing quality assessment, they used their data or their findings in a helpful way that allowed efficient ways for learning to take place for these students. So these were students with learning disabilities or behavioral problems, and they found that students learn better in different environments based off of their unique needs. And there's more information about this on page 282 and 283 if you're interested in looking into that a little bit more. But we've gone through the different components of quality assessment. Now let's go over what different types of assessment there are. So we have standardized, which is almost like a bad word to us maybe, but it has its place. Standardized testing results are used outside of the classroom. So that means that generally the grades or scores go to districts or to the state, and the data is utilized on those levels. SRBI is another good example of that. And then we have summative. This is like your basic paper and a pencil test that you give students at the end of a unit. Usually with these, we're looking for what do you know, or what did you memorize, or what have you learned. These are generally teacher-made and used by the teacher to generate grades or scores at their level. And then we have formative assessment, which is also on the teacher level, and it's informal as opposed to standardized and summative. Formative assessment should be fairly regular and consistent as we are teaching. You can use these to assess student needs and also their strengths and their weaknesses. And you can also check for understanding this way. You can have students hold up their thumbs, like thumbs up if you get this, or thumbs down if you don't. Something like that is formative. And then we also need to cover traditional versus authentic or alternative. So traditional is just what it sounds like. It's usually multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, etc. Usually we use this when we want students to recall or recognize information, or sometimes memorize is usually what happens. And then the evaluation tool here is the answer key. Standardized tests and summative tests usually follow in this in the traditional form. Then we have authentic or alternative, and this is argued to be more diverse friendly because it tests application of knowledge rather than relying on students' ability to read or memorize or retain info like in the traditional setting. And we look at student performance here and gauge different things like decision making, experimenting, conceptual learning, and the evaluation tool here is rubrics. So we grade them based off of a rubric system. Or we assess them, sorry, not grade. And then going back here, the important thing to note here is that there isn't a good or bad way to assess. Each of these has their place, and they can be used effectively and responsibly. However, we do want to make sure that we're mixing it up often and that we're not always doing the same thing every time. We're not always doing formative or standardized all the time, but remembering that each one of these has a different purpose. So it should be different every time. And then if this helps you guys, this is just my way of summarizing this section. If it helps, read through this, go over these slides again if you want to, and I'll let Daniel take over for section 10.2.